March 1, 1896. The highlands of northern Ethiopia, 20,000 Italian troops advance toward what they anticipate will be a straightforward colonial takeover. They envision disorganized opposition, outdated weaponry, a swift triumph before midday. What confronts them instead is 100,000 Ethiopian fighters positioned in flawless military array. Standing at their core is Emperor Mentalik II, someone who has dedicated 10 years orchestrating preparations for precisely this confrontation. Next to him stands Empress Titu Betul, who has independently rallied armed forces and persuaded doubtful territorial chiefs that collective strength represents their singular opportunity for survival. Italy presumes Ethiopia constitutes merely another segment of Africa, ready for claiming. They possess no comprehension they're advancing into the most devastating loss a European nation will experience in Africa throughout the complete colonial period. Yet how did Ethiopia, singular among African territories, accomplish defeating a contemporary European military force? What understanding did Menelik possess that escaped every other African ruler? And what costs would Ethiopia bear for achieving this triumph? This represents the chronicle of the Battle of Adwa, the moment Africa demonstrated it remained unconquered. To comprehend why Adwa holds significance, we must return 15 years prior to a meeting chamber in Berlin throughout the winter of 1884. Within that chamber, European authorities are sketching boundaries on an African map. No African representatives are attending. Nobody requests authorization. The complete continent undergoes division like pastry at a social gathering, with each European nation staking its portion. Britain secures enormous territories across the east and south. France proclaims immense expanses of West and North Africa. Germany obtains strategic holdings. Belgium's King Leopold II declares the Congo Basin as his private possession, a choice that will result in one of history's most terrible atrocities. Portugal enlarges its centuries-established coastal domains. Spain acquires smaller regions in the northwest and beside the Gulf of Guinea. And Italy appears tardy to colonialism. United merely in 1861, the fresh Italian nation urgently desires to establish itself as a significant power. It desires an empire matching Britain and France. It desires status, materials, and worldwide acknowledgement. Italy examines the map and observes one area still predominantly unclaimed, the Horn of Africa. The Italians create a stronghold in Eritrea along the Red Sea shoreline in 1885. It's a tactical location, controlling crucial commercial passages. From that point, they start observing the historic kingdom immediately southward Ethiopia. However, Ethiopia differs from other African regions. It has never experienced colonization. It has functioned as an autonomous kingdom for millennia, possessing its own writing system, its own Christian institution dating to the 4th century, and its own intricate governmental framework. More significantly, Ethiopia possesses something most African kingdoms absence. In 1885, substantially organized state with an operational central administration, a combat-tested warrior heritage, and a ruler who grasps precisely what Europe is executing to Africa. That ruler is Mentalik. The second, Mentalik enters existence in 1844 in the Shawan territory of central Ethiopia. His birth designation is Sahel Mariam. He matures throughout a turbulent phase in Ethiopian chronicles, recognized as the Zamin Masafintha period of nobles, when territorial lords perpetually battle one another for authority, and the empire splinters into rival kingdoms. As a youth, Mentalik observes his father's conquest by an opposing emperor. He's seized as captive and detained for 10 years in the imperial capital. Yet this imprisonment transforms into his instruction. He absorbs statecraft, military tactics, diplomacy, and most critically, he absorbs patience. When he ultimately escapes and returns to Shua in 1865, he's 21 years old and resolved to reconstruct his father's domain. Across the subsequent 24 years, he converts Shua from a struggling territory into the most dominant region in Ethiopia. He modernizes the military forces. He creates commercial relationships with European authorities, meticulously positioning them against each other. He imports contemporary rifles, thousands upon thousands. While other Ethiopian rulers cling to conventional weaponry, he constructs infrastructure, creates a postal network, and develops a telegraph system. Most critically, he observes what's transpiring in the remainder of Africa. He witnesses ancient kingdoms collapse to European armies. He examines their methods, their weapons, their approaches. He detects a configuration. African kingdoms fall because they combat isolated, because they miscalculate European military technology, and because they neglect to adapt. Menelik determines Ethiopia will not commit these errors. In 1889, Emperor Johannes IV perishes in combat against modest forces from Sudan. Menelik, currently 45 years old, claims the imperial position. He becomes Emperor of Ethiopia, King of Kings and the elect of God, traditional designations that carry tremendous significance. Owewe. Menelik recognizes titles signify nothing if he cannot safeguard his empire from the European powers circling like He requires weapons, he requires diplomatic acknowledgement, he requires time to consolidate Ethiopian unity, and that's when Italy executes its maneuver. The Italians perceive an opening. A fresh emperor signifies potential instability. They approach Menelik with a proposition: diplomatic backing, contemporary weapons, and financial assistance in exchange for a friendship treaty. On May 2, 1889, merely months following assuming the throne, Menelik signs the Treaty of Wuchale with Italian delegates. The treaty is composed in two languages, Italian and Amharic, Ethiopia's official language. Both parties negotiate in genuine faith, or so it appears. The treaty provides Italy certain commercial privileges. It establishes boundaries between Ethiopia and Italian-controlled Eritrea. It creates diplomatic procedures, and then exists Article 17. In the Amharic edition, Article 17 declares that Emperor Menelik may utilize Italian diplomatic channels for communications with other European authorities if he desires. My optional, a courtesy. However, in the Italian edition, the phrasing differs. Article 17 declares that Emperor Menelik will utilize Italian diplomatic channels for all communications with European powers. Must mandatory, obligatory. It's a subtle distinction with enormous ramifications. Italy commences informing other European powers that Ethiopia has consented to become an Italian protectorate, essentially a colony by alternative designation. Under international law at that period, if Ethiopia constitutes an Italian protectorate, Italy controls Ethiopia's foreign relations. At the Berlin Conference, European powers agreed not to interfere with each other's colonial assertions. If Italy can persuade everyone that Ethiopia belongs to Italy, no other European power will distribute weapons to Ethiopia or acknowledge Ethiopian sovereignty. Menelik doesn't realize what has transpired immediately. The treaty delivers him contemporary rifles, 40,000 of them. It delivers diplomatic recognition. It grants him breathing space to consolidate authority. However, gradually, disturbing reports reach his court. Italian publications are labeling Ethiopia as Italian East Africa. Italian diplomats are obstructing Ethiopian representatives from meeting with other European authorities. Italian military forces are advancing deeper into Ethiopian territory, beyond the agreed boundaries, creating forts and outposts. In 1890, Menelik dispatches representatives to Rome to address trade arrangements. The Italians refuse to meet with them, stating that as subjects of an Italian protectorate, Ethiopians cannot execute independent foreign relations. That's when Menelik extracts both versions of the treaty and compares them word by word. The mistranslation is evident. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is intentional deception. Menelik is enraged, but he doesn't display it. He's mastered patience. Instead, he initiates a careful diplomatic campaign, composing letters to European powers explaining the discrepancy. He sends representatives to Britain, France, and Russia with copies of both treaty versions. Some European leaders demonstrate sympathy but remain cautious. Italy is a European power. Ethiopia is an African kingdom. Most Europeans presume Africa belongs to Europe by natural entitlement. For 3 years, Menelik attempts diplomacy e proposes compromessi. He suggests he appeals to international law. Italy rejects every proposal. They maintain the Italian version of the treaty is accurate, and that Ethiopia must acknowledge protectorate status. Finally, on February 12, 1893, Menelik sends a letter to Italian King Umberto I. The message is transparent and conclusive. The Treaty of Wuchale is null and invalid. Ethiopia will not be an Italian protectorate. Ethiopia will not submit. However, none of them anticipated what Italy would determine next. In Rome, Italian politicians are fragmented. Some recognize that Ethiopia is not a typical colonial objective. It has a substantial population, an operational government, and a military heritage stretching back centuries. However, others perceive only opportunity and damaged pride. Italy has wagered its international reputation on controlling Ethiopia. If they withdraw now, they'll be humiliated before all of Europe. The Italian press has spent years depicting Ethiopia as a primitive kingdom awaiting civilization. The public anticipates colonial expansion. More significantly, there's a political calculation. Italy's government is unstable. Prime Minister Francesco Crispi requires a foreign victory to distract from domestic difficulties and unite the nation behind his leadership. Crispi is a hardline nationalist who believes profoundly in Italy's entitlement to empire. He examines a map and observes that Italy controls Eritrea to the north of Ethiopia. If they can conquer Ethiopia, they'll control the complete Horn of Africa, a massive territory that would establish Italy as a major colonial power instantly. He accepts the military evaluation. Ethiopian armies employ outdated methods. They absence contemporary artillery. Their forces are undisciplined. Italian troops possess modern rifles, machine guns, and artillery pieces. Italian officers are trained in European military institutions. On documentation, Italy should triumph. Crispi authorizes the military buildup. Throughout 1894 and 1895, Italy channels resources into Eritrea. They transport thousands of troops from Italy. They construct supply warehouses and roads. They accumulate ammunition and artillery shells. The Italian commander in Eritrea is General Oreste But, a veteran colonial officer who has participated in multiple campaigns. He's confident, experienced, and profoundly underestimates his adversary. Baratieri commences advancing Italian forces south from Eritrea into Ethiopian territory, seizing strategic locations. He captures border fortifications and creates Italian garrisons deep inside Ethiopia. Each Italian advance constitutes a test. Baratieri anticipates Ethiopian resistance to disintegrate. Instead, he discovers coordinated defensive reactions. Ethiopian forces withdraw strategically, avoiding decisive engagements while harassing Italian supply routes. Menelik observes these provocations carefully. He understands Italy desires him to react hastily, to dispatch poorly organized forces into combat before he's prepared. So he waits. And while he waits, he prepares. Menelik comprehends something fundamental that many African leaders overlooked. Defeating a European army demands more than courage. It demands organization, unity, logistics, intelligence, and timing. First, he requires weapons, modern weapons. Fortunately, European powers are content to distribute weapons to anyone who can compensate, even if it undermines their colonial ambitions. Britain and France possess no affection for Italy's expansion in the Horn of Africa, as it threatens their own interests. Russia, an Orthodox Christian nation, holds cultural sympathy for Ethiopia's ancient Orthodox Church. Menelik exploits these rivalries brilliantly. He purchases contemporary rifles from France substantial quantities. He acquires artillery pieces from Russia. He obtains ammunition from Swiss and Belgian arms merchants. British traders in Aden sell him weapons, claiming they didn't know the final destination. By 1895, Ethiopia has accumulated approximately 100,000 contemporary rifles and dozens of artillery pieces. It's an enormous arsenal, equivalent to or exceeding what Italy possesses in Eritrea. However, weapons alone won't secure the war. Menelik requires something more difficult to accomplish: unity. Ethiopia in 1895 is not a centralized nation-state like Italy. It's a federation of territories, each with its own ruler, culture, and concerns. The territorial lords, designated Ras, possess their own armies and frequently compete with each other for power and resources. Historically, when Ethiopia confronts external threats, regional leaders quarrel instead of uniting. Previous Ethiopian emperors have fallen because they couldn't achieve regional lords to cooperate. Menelik initiates a patient diplomatic campaign to unite Ethiopia's regional powers behind his leadership. He dispatches messengers to every major ras, explaining the threat Italy presents not merely to his throne, but to Ethiopian independence itself. He appeals to national pride. He appeals to religious identity. Ethiopians perceive themselves as defenders of Christian Africa. He executes political agreements, offering regional autonomy and power sharing in exchange for military cooperation. Some ras join immediately, others hesitate. A few actively oppose. That's when Empress Titu Batul enters as a historical force. Titu Batul is not simply Menelik's wife. She's a political power in her own capacity. Born around 1851 into Ethiopian nobility, Titu matures in the imperial court throughout the era of princes. She's educated, politically sharp, and intensely ambitious. Her family connections grant her influence across multiple territories. She marries Menelik. In 1883, her fourth marriage and his second. It's a political alliance that transforms into a genuine partnership. Menelik respects Titu's intelligence and political instincts. She comprehends court intrigue, regional politics, and how to construct consensus among competing factions. More significantly, Titu is a fierce Ethiopian nationalist. She distrusts all European powers and believes Ethiopia must resist colonialism with absolute determination. When the crisis with Italy escalates, Titu becomes one of the strongest voices urging Menelik toward war. Some of Menelik's advisors counsel caution and compromise. Titu argues that compromise with colonial powers invariably leads to subjugation. She indicates what transpired in other segments of African kingdoms that attempted to negotiate and ended up colonized regardless. However, Titu doesn't merely argue for war. She takes action. She travels personally to regions where Ras are hesitating. She utilizes her family connections and political abilities to convince skeptical leaders that unity is essential. She appeals to their pride, their faith, and their survival instincts. She organizes supply chains. She assists coordinating the logistics of moving and feeding massive armies. She establishes communication networks between regional forces. When Ethiopian forces commence mobilizing in late 1895, Ta2 personally leads a significant force from the imperial capital of Addis Ababa northward toward the front lines. She delivers thousands of warriors and establishes supply depots along the route. Contemporary Italian intelligence reports document Titu's movements with concern. They realize she's not merely a symbolic figure. She's an active military and political leader whose influence rivals the emperor's. European observers at the time struggled to comprehend Titu's role. Victorian gender standards can't fathom a woman wielding such direct political and military authority. However, in Ethiopian tradition, powerful women have consistently played significant roles in governance and warfare. Titu will prove essential, not merely in mobilizing Ethiopia before the battle, but during the battle itself. However, first, Ethiopia requires actually getting its forces to the front, and that presents an enormous logistical challenge. In September 1895, Menelik issues a national summons to arms. The message propagates across Ethiopia through messengers, church networks, and regional proclamations. What follows is one of the largest military mobilizations in African history. From Shua, Menelik's home territory, arrive tens of thousands of warriors. From Tigray in the north, the powerful Ras Alala delivers battle-hardened veterans who have fought Italians previously. From Gojam, in the west, Ras Tekel Hamanot leads his forces. From Wallo, Ras Mikhail brings cavalry and infantry. The regional leaders deliver not merely soldiers, but complete support systems. Every fighting man requires food, water, and ammunition. Each regional army includes camp followers, supplies, livestock, and equipment. Ethiopian military tradition is distinctive. Warriors are not professional soldiers in the European understanding. They're farmers, herders, and craftsmen who assume arms when summoned. However, they're trained from youth in combat abilities, horsemanship, and tactics. Many have fought in regional conflicts and border wars. They carry a combination of traditional and contemporary weapons. Some possess modern rifles purchased by Others carry older firearms. Many still bring traditional weapons, swords, spears, and shields, not because they're primitive, but because ammunition is limited and close combat might be necessary. Ethiopian cavalry is particularly formidable. Horsemen trained from childhood can traverse vast distances quickly and execute complex maneuvers. They're scouts, raiders, and shock troops all at once. The mobilization consumes months. Regional armies must travel hundreds of miles, frequently through difficult mountainous terrain. They must coordinate movements, establish supply lines, and maintain organization. By December 1895, Ethiopian forces commence concentrating in the north near the boundary with Italian-occupied Eritrea. Conservative estimates position the total force at approximately 100,000 warriors. Some historians suggest the number might be even higher. It's an enormous army by any standard, larger than the total population of many African kingdoms. Coordinating such a force represents a staggering logistical achievement. Menelik establishes his headquarters and commences organizing the forces into a coherent structure. Regional armies maintain their own commands, but coordinate under overall imperial strategy. Ethiopian scouts commence monitoring Italian movements closely. Meanwhile, in Eritrea, General Baratieri is developing concern. Italian intelligence reports the massive Ethiopian buildup. Baratieri realizes this isn't the scattered resistance he anticipated. This is a national mobilization on a scale that challenges his assumptions. However, Baratieri confronts his own difficulties. His forces are stretched thin across occupied territories. Supply lines from Italy are extended and unreliable. His troops are increasingly demoralized as they realize the enemy they face is not weak or disorganized. Worse, political pressure from Rome is mounting. Prime Minister Crispi demands action. Italian newspapers criticize Baratieri for being excessively cautious. The Italian public anticipates a quick, decisive victory. Baratieri desires to wait, to build up his forces further, to permit the Ethiopian army's logistics collapse under its own weight. Feeding 100,000 men in the field is extraordinarily difficult. He hopes time is on his side. But time is running out for Baratieri. In December 1895, Menelik determines to take the initiative. Waiting too long will exhaust his supplies and permit Italy to reinforce. He orders Ethiopian forces to commence offensive operations. The first major engagement occurs at Amba Alagi, a strategic mountain fortress where Italian forces have established a garrison. Ethiopian forces under Ras Makanan, one of Menelik's most capable commanders, surround the location in early December. The Italians maintain position for weeks, anticipating relief that never arrives. Finally, on December 7th, the garrison surrenders. Major Pietro Toselli, the Italian commander, is killed in the final assault. Over 2,000 Italian and Eritrean troops become prisoners. It's a shocking defeat for Italy. European armies don't surrender to African forces. The news causes consternation in Rome and celebration in Addis Ababa. However, Menelik isn't finished. In mid-January 1896, Ethiopian forces attack another Italian position at a fortified town where Baratieri has concentrated a significant garrison. The siege of Mekelle lasts 2 weeks. Ethiopian forces cut off water supplies and bombard the Italian positions with their Russian artillery. The Italian garrison, commanded by Major Giuseppe Galliano, maintains position desperately, hoping for relief. Baratieri attempts to break the siege, but his forces can't reach Mekelle in time. On January 21st, with his troops dying of thirst and running out of ammunition, Galliano negotiates a surrender. This time, Menelik executes a calculated determination. Instead of taking the Italians prisoner, he permits them to retreat to Eritrea, requiring them to leave all weapons and equipment behind. It's a brilliant psychological maneuver. The defeated Italian soldiers return to Eritrea and spread demoralization through the Italian ranks. They relay stories of massive Ethiopian armies, coordinated tactics, and effective artillery. They describe an enemy who fights with courage and discipline. Baratieri's position becomes increasingly untenable. He's lost 2 significant garrisons without inflicting serious damage on Ethiopian forces. His troops are demoralized. His supply situation is deteriorating. And then on February 8, 1896, he receives a telegram from Prime Minister Crispi that changes everything. The message is brief and brutal. Achieve a decisive victory immediately, or you will be replaced with someone who can. Baratieri understands what this signifies. His career, his reputation, and his honor are at stake. A must attack, and he must triumph. However, he possesses no idea what Menelik has prepared for him. Baratieri finally determines on a plan. He will advance south with his entire available force, seek a decisive battle with the main Ethiopian army, and utilize superior Italian firepower and tactics to break Ethiopian resistance. He assembles approximately 20,000 troops. About 15,000 are Italian soldiers, with the remainder being Eritrean Askari local soldiers fighting for the Italians. He brings artillery batteries, machine guns, and substantial ammunition reserves. His plan is to move quickly and surprise Ethiopian forces before they can fully concentrate. He hopes to catch regional Ethiopian armies separated and defeat them in detail. On February 29, 1896, Italian forces commence marching south from their positions in Eritrea, heading toward the town of Adwa, where Ethiopian forces are concentrated. The march happens at night, intended to achieve surprise and avoid the harsh daytime heat. Baratieri divides his force into 4 brigade-sized columns, each following separate mountain paths that should converge near Adwa at dawn. It's an ambitious plan that requires precise coordination in difficult terrain. However, Baratieri commits a critical mistake. His maps are inaccurate. The mountain passes around Adwa are poorly surveyed. Ethiopian scouts have been monitoring Italian movements for weeks and understand the terrain perfectly. Menelik knows the Italians are coming. Ethiopian scouts shatter the Italian columns throughout the night, sending runners back to update Menelik on Italian positions and movements. Instead of being surprised, Menelik is prepared. He has positioned his forces across the hills and valleys surrounding Adwa in a massive crescent formation. Ethiopian armies occupy high ground with commanding views of the approaches. As dawn breaks on March 1, 1896, the Italian columns are scattered across difficult terrain, struggling to maintain coordination. They've marched all night through mountain passes. They're tired, strung out, and no longer in tight formation. And that's when they observe what's waiting for them. Across the hills surrounding Adwa stand Ethiopian forces as far as the eye can see, tens of thousands of warriors in organized formations. Artillery batteries positioned on high ground, cavalry units prepared to exploit any weakness. The Italian officers experience a moment of terrible realization. They're not catching an unprepared enemy by surprise. They've walked into a prepared defensive position held by a force that outnumbers them 5-1, but it's too late to retreat. The battle has already commenced. The first shots of the Battle of Adwa ring out around 5:30 a.m. as Italian advance guards make contact with Ethiopian forward positions. General Baratieri's brigade commanders quickly realize their situation is far worse than anticipated. The 4 Italian columns that were supposed to converge in coordinated fashion are separated by rugged terrain. They can't support each other effectively. The rightmost Italian column, commanded by General Vitaru, is furthest from the other Italian forces. He's moving through a valley with Ethiopian forces on the surrounding heights. In the center, brigades, under Generals Matteo Alberthon and Giuseppe Aramande, are encountering the main Ethiopian positions. They're receiving fire from multiple directions as Ethiopian forces on the high ground pour rifle fire into the Italian columns. The leftmost column under General Giuseppe Elena is struggling to advance through difficult terrain while under constant harassment from Ethiopians. Baratieri, positioned with the reserve forces, attempts to coordinate his scattered brigades. But communication is nearly impossible in the chaos of battle. Runners can't move quickly through the mountainous terrain. The Italian columns are fighting what amounts to 4 separate battles instead of one coordinated action. Menelik, positioned on high ground near the center of Ethiopian forces, has clear visibility of most of the battlefield. He's coordinated with his regional commanders beforehand, and each knows their role. The Ethiopian battle plan is sophisticated. Hold the high ground, utilize superior numbers to envelop Italian columns, preserve ammunition by choosing targets carefully, use cavalry to exploit breakthroughs, and cut off retreating units. General Albertoni's brigade, advancing in the center, runs directly into the main Ethiopian position held by forces under Ras Alula and other Tigrian warriors. These are veterans who have fought Italians previously and know their tactics. Ethiopian artillery opens up, firing shells into the Italian formations. The Italians are shocked to find themselves under effective artillery fire. They presumed Ethiopian artillery would be poorly trained or ineffective. Albertone's brigade commences taking heavy casualties. Italian soldiers are trained to fight in tight formations with coordinated volley fire, but Ethiopian forces are utilizing the terrain effectively, advancing and retreating fluidly, making the Italian formations vulnerable to enfilading fire. Around 6:30 a.m., after less than an hour of fighting, Albertone realizes his brigade is in danger of being surrounded. He attempts to pull back to more defensible positions, but the retreat quickly becomes disorganized. Ethiopian cavalry, waiting for exactly this moment, charges into the disorganized Italian units. Warriors armed with swords and spears crash into Italian formations that are already wavering under rifle fire. The fighting becomes hand-to-hand. Italian soldiers trained to shoot at distant targets suddenly find themselves in close combat with Ethiopian warriors who have trained with swords from childhood. It's brutal, chaotic, and terrifying. Albertone's brigade commences to collapse. Thousands of Italian soldiers are killed, wounded, or captured. Albertone himself is captured, along with many of his officers. By 8 a.m., the Italian center has effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. But the battle is far from concluded. While the center collapses, General de Bermuda's brigade on the Italian right flank is marching deeper into a trap. De Bermuda possesses poor maps and limited visibility. He believes he's moving to envelop the Ethiopian left flank. In reality, he's marching into a valley surrounded by Ethiopian forces on three sides. Ethiopian regional armies under Ross, Michael Volo, and other commanders have positioned themselves perfectly to ambush de Bermuda's column. They hold their fire, permitting the Italian brigade march deeper into the valley. When de Bermuda finally realizes his situation around 9 a.m., Ethiopian forces open fire from three directions simultaneously. His brigade is caught in a devastating crossfire. De Bermuda attempts to fight his way out, but there's no favorable direction to retreat. Ethiopian forces block every escape route. His artillery is overwhelmed. His infantry formations are shredded by rifle fire from the surrounding heights. The situation degenerates into a desperate struggle for survival. Italian soldiers fight in small groups, attempting to find cover in terrain that offers none. Ethiopian warriors advance steadily, maintaining fire discipline and utilizing superior numbers to envelop and isolate Italian units. By 10 a.m., de Bermuda's brigade has been effectively annihilated. General de Bermuda himself perishes in the fighting, whether killed in combat or taking his own life to avoid capture remains disputed. Of the 4,000 men in de Bermuda's brigade, fewer than 200 will escape back to Eritrea. The rest are deceased, wounded, or captured. Meanwhile, General Aramanda's brigade in the center-left is fighting desperately to maintain any coherent defensive position. After Albertone's collapse, Aramande is confronting the full weight of Mentelik's central forces. Empress Taitu is personally present in this sector, coordinating supply lines and ensuring ammunition reaches Ethiopian forces. Contemporary accounts describe her rallying troops and directing remarkable sight that Italian prisoners later recall with a mixture of respect and disbelief. Aramanda's men fight with courage, maintaining disciplined volley fire, even as Ethiopian forces press from multiple sides. Italian artillery performs effectively, temporarily checking Ethiopian advances with devastating shell fire. However, ammunition is running low. The Italians are outnumbered. Their flanks are exposed with Albertone captured and de Bermuda destroyed. Around 11 a.m., Ethiopian forces execute a major push against Aramandi's position. Thousands of warriors charge simultaneously from multiple directions. The Italian defensive line wavers, then breaks. General Arimondi, attempting to rally his men, is killed in the fighting. His brigade commences a fighting retreat that quickly becomes a rout as organization collapses. Italian soldiers throw away their equipment and run. Ethiopian cavalry pursues, cutting down fleeing men. The retreat becomes a massacre. Only General Elina's brigade on the Italian left remains relatively intact, and only because it hasn't yet been fully engaged. Elena, observing the disaster unfolding, orders an immediate retreat before his brigade suffers the same fate. By noon, the Battle of Adwa is effectively concluded. The Italian army is shattered. Thousands of Italian soldiers are deceased or dying on the battlefield. Thousands more are captured. The survivors are fleeing in complete disorder back toward Eritrea. Baratieri, watching the destruction of his army, possesses no choice but to retreat with the remnants. His career is finished. His army is destroyed, and Italy's colonial ambitions in Ethiopia have been decisively crushed. However, what transpired next nearly shattered Ethiopia's hopes. The immediate aftermath of Adwa is chaos. The battlefield is covered with the deceased and wounded from both sides. Ethiopian casualties are significant, estimated between 7,000 and 10,000 killed and wounded. It's a heavy price, but in proportion to their total forces, it's sustainable. Ethiopian Medical Corps moves through the battlefield, recovering wounded warriors. Italian casualties are catastrophic. Approximately 6,000 Italian and Eritrean soldiers are deceased. Another 1,500 are wounded. Nearly 3,000 are captured. For a European army, these are shocking losses. Entire regiments have been wiped out. Multiple general officers are deceased or captured. The Italian command structure in East Africa has effectively ceased to exist. However, Mentalik confronts an immediate crisis. What to execute with thousands of prisoners? Feeding, guarding, and transporting 3,000 prisoners is an enormous logistical burden. Ethiopian forces are already stretched, maintaining their own supply lines. There's pressure from some quarters to simply execute the prisoners. In Ethiopian military tradition, captured enemies are sometimes killed to prevent them from returning to fight again. Mentalik executes a controversial but strategically brilliant determination. He will treat the Italian prisoners humanely. He knows the world is observing. European powers are waiting to observe if Ethiopia will commit atrocities against white prisoners, which would provide them moral justification for intervention. Mentalik will not provide them that excuse. The Italian prisoners are treated relatively well, provided food and medical attention. Wounded prisoners receive care from Ethiopian medical personnel. Officers are permitted to keep their personal possessions. However, there's one exception that shocks European observers. Eritrean askari, who fought for Italy, are treated harshly. Ethiopian tradition views them as traitors Africans who fought for colonial masters against their own people. Many are mutilated as punishment, a practice that horrifies Europeans but fits Ethiopian military customs. This distinction is important to Menelik. He desires to send a message. Europeans who fight will be treated according to international norms. Africans who fight for colonizers will face traditional justice. Over the following weeks, Italian prisoners are marched back to Addis Ababa. The journey is difficult and many suffer, but most survive. Eventually, they're ransomed back to Italy in exchange for recognition of Ethiopian sovereignty. Meanwhile, news of the Italian defeat propagates across the world like wildfire. If you're still here, you're clearly enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most important battles. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more powerful history stories like this one. We're just getting to the global consequences of what transpired at Adwa. When news reaches Europe that Italy has suffered a catastrophic defeat in Ethiopia, the reaction is disbelief. European newspapers initially report the battle as a minor setback. Surely the telegraphs are confused. Surely African forces couldn't actually defeat a contemporary European army in open battle. However, as Italian survivors reach Eritrea and telegraph lines carry their accounts back to Rome, the truth becomes undeniable. In Italy, the reaction is devastation. The government falls. Prime Minister Crispi resigns in disgrace. There are riots in some Italian cities as the public realizes their sons have perished in a colonial disaster that never should have occurred. The Italian Chamber of Deputies holds angry debates. Political opponents blame Crispi for the disaster. Military officials blame each other. Everyone is searching for someone to blame for the humiliation. King Umberto, whose approval made the war possible, confronts public criticism for the first time in his reign. The disaster at Adwa will haunt Italian politics for decades. In other European capitals, the response is more complex. Britain and France, while officially sympathetic to Italy, are privately pleased. Italy's failure signifies less competition in the colonial scramble for Africa. British and French officials take quiet satisfaction in observing an upstart rival cut down to size. Germany's response is more strategic. Kaiser Wilhelm II's government views Adwa as a lesson. African kingdoms with modern weapons and organization can resist European conquest. Future colonial campaigns must be planned more carefully. Russia, Ethiopia's Orthodox Christian ally, celebrates openly. Russian newspapers praise Ethiopian bravery and Christian solidarity against Catholic imperialism. However, the most profound reactions occur outside Europe, in colonized and threatened territories across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Adwa proves something revolutionary. European military superiority is not inevitable. Soldiers of color can defeat white armies. Modern weapons in competent hands can overcome colonial forces. In Haiti, the world's first black republic, newspapers celebrate Adwa as proof of black military capability. Haitian intellectuals compose essays connecting Ethiopian resistance to Haiti's own successful revolution against France a century earlier. In India, nationalist leaders study accounts of the battle. If Ethiopia can resist colonization through unity and organization, perhaps India can execute the same. The Battle of Adwa becomes a subject of study in early Indian nationalist circles. In the Caribbean and Americas, African diaspora communities celebrate Adwa as a source of pride. Ethiopia, the final major independent African kingdom, has proven Africa can resist Europe. Marcus Garvey, the influential Pan-African leader who will emerge decades later, will cite Adwa as inspiration for his Back to Africa movement. The battle becomes a symbol of African resistance and capability. W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African-American scholar and activist, writes extensively about Adwa's significance. He argues that the battle should be studied alongside other great military victories in world history, not treated as a curious anomaly, but recognized as a turning point in the relationship between Europe and the rest of the world. However, beyond symbolic importance, Adwa possesses immediate practical consequences.